A simple elderly woman is mocked by elite shooters at the shooting range, but everyone falls silent when she grabs the gun. Eleanor Wilson carefully folded the worn photograph and placed it back in her wallet. Her late husband Frank's smile still warmed her heart, even 12 years after his passing. The small Texas house they'd shared for 40 years felt emptier these days. At 72, Eleanor's life had settled into a quiet routine of gardening, book club meeting, and weekly calls with her son in California. This morning, however, was different. She'd woken with a sense of purpose after dreaming of Frank. In the dream, they were back at the shooting range, where he'd taught her to handle firearms nearly 5 decades ago. Frank, a decorated Marine who'd served 2 tours in Vietnam, had believed everyone should know how to protect themselves. "Remember, Ellie," he'd say in his gentle drawl, "it's not about violence, it's about confidence and control." Eleanor pulled the oak box from beneath their bed and unlocked it. Inside lay Frank's Colt 1911, meticulously maintained despite years of disuse. Her fingers traced the smooth metal, memories flooding back of weekend afternoons at the range, Frank's patient instruction, and the satisfaction of hitting targets with increasing precision. The local news played in the background, reporting another home invasion in a nearby neighborhood. Eleanor thought of Mrs. Peterson, recently widowed and living alone just like her. The decision crystallized in her mind. It was time to refresh her skills. She called her neighbor Thomas, a retired police officer who occasionally mentioned shooting at the new range outside town. "Blue Ridge Shooting Club? Sure, it's nice, but different from the old days," Thomas explained. "Lot of young hotshots with expensive gear. You sure about this, Eleanor?" "Never been more sure," she replied, her voice firmer than it had been in months. After breakfast, Eleanor dressed in practical jeans and a light blue button-up. Nothing fancy, just comfortable clothes for a day out. She secured the gun case in her car trunk according to regulations and headed toward the foothills where the club was located. The drive gave her time to reminisce. Frank teaching her to shoot had been his way of ensuring she'd be safe when he deployed. What began as a practical skill became their shared passion, a way to connect. By the time he retired from the Corps, they'd competed in several local tournaments together. But after his heart attack, the guns were packed away along with many of their shared hobbies. Eleanor pulled into the parking lot of what was now an upscale facility. Nothing like the simple range they'd frequented decades ago. Glass and steel had replaced the weathered wooden structures she remembered. Young men and women in tactical gear unloaded expensive-looking cases from luxury vehicles. For a moment, Eleanor hesitated, feeling out of place. But then she thought of Frank's favorite saying, "Courage isn't about not being scared, it's about moving forward anyway." With a deep breath, she grabbed her simple case and walked toward the entrance, her posture straightening with each step. The air-conditioned lobby of Blue Ridge Shooting Club smelled of coffee and gun oil. Eleanor approached the front desk where a young woman with a tight ponytail barely looked up from her computer. "Membership card?" she asked, fingers hovering over the keyboard. "I don't have one. I'd like to pay for a day pass," Eleanor replied. The receptionist finally looked up, her expression shifting to something between surprise and amusement. "Have you ever handled a firearm before, ma'am? We require safety certification for first-timers." Eleanor couldn't help but smile. "Yes, dear. I've handled firearms before." After completing the paperwork and paying the fee, significantly higher than she'd expected, Eleanor was directed to the indoor range. She could hear the rhythmic gunfire before she even opened the door. Inside, the range was occupied by about a dozen shooters, most appearing to be in their 30s or 40s. The stalls were equipped with electronic target systems and overhead screens displaying shot pattern. Nothing like the paper targets and manual pulley systems Frank had taught her on. Eleanor selected an empty lane at the far end, setting her case on the counter. As she began unpacking, she became aware of eyes on her. 3 men in the adjacent lanes had paused their shooting and were watching with undisguised curiosity. "Oh, can I help you with something?" one of them called out. He was tall with a precisely trimmed beard, wearing what looked like tactical gear that had never seen actual use. "Just setting up," Eleanor replied pleasantly. The men exchanged glances. The bearded one stepped closer, speaking louder as if Eleanor might be hard of hearing. "This isn't like shooting tin cans in the backyard, ma'am. These are serious weapons," his companions smirked. One of them, wearing an expensive-looking shooting vest, emblazoned with competition patches, added, "Lane 7 might have some 10-22 pistols if you want something with less kick." Eleanor calmly continued arranging her station. "I'm comfortable with what I brought. Thank you." "What are you shooting anyway? A little revolver?" asked the third man, leaning over to peer at her case. Eleanor unfolded her cleaning cloth, laying it precisely on the counter before removing Frank's Colt. 1911 .45 caliber. "My husband's service pistol." Their expressions shifted from amusement to mild surprise, but the bearded man recovered quickly. "Beautiful gun, but it's got quite a recoil. Just don't want you hurting yourself." "That's thoughtful," Eleanor replied, loading the magazine with practiced ease. "I appreciate your concern." As she prepared to shoot, more curious glances came her way. Two younger shooters nearby had stopped to watch, whispering and smiling. Eleanor heard snippets, probably can't even see the target, and gonna jump right out of her hand. Eleanor took a slow breath, blocking out the distraction. She donned her ear protection, simple compared to the electronic noise-canceling headsets others wore, and positioned herself in the stance Frank had taught her decades. The bearded man leaned against the divider, arms crossed, clearly expecting entertainment. His friends had positioned themselves to watch as well, phones discreetly ready to capture any mishap. Eleanor felt a moment of doubt. It had been years. What if she embarrassed herself? Then she remembered Frank's steady hands covering hers, his voice in her ear. "Focus on your breathing, Ellie. Nothing else exists but you, the gun, and the target." She raised the pistol, sighted down the barrel, and prepared to fire. The first shot rang out, followed rapidly by 5 more in quick succession. Each bullet found its mark in a tight grouping at the center of the target. The kind of precision that comes only from years of practice and muscle memory. Eleanor lowered the weapon, engaged the safety, and set it down before removing her ear protection. The silence around her was profound. The bearded man and his friends stood motionless, their expressions frozen in disbelief. "Beginner's luck," one of them finally offered weakly. Eleanor smiled politely and pressed the button to bring her target forward. The holes were clustered within a 2-inch circle at center mass, what Frank would have called minute of bad guy accuracy. "Mind if I try again?" she asked, not really expecting an answer. She reloaded efficiently and sent the target back to position. This time, she fired more rapidly, emptying the magazine in a controlled but impressive cadence. The grouping was even tighter than before. Muscle memory fully awakened now. By the time she lowered the gun again, a small crowd had gathered. The bearded man's smirk had vanished, replaced by a look of genuine curiosity. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" he asked, his tone respectful now. Eleanor began cleaning her station as she replied, "My husband taught me when we were first married in 1972. He was a Marine, served in Vietnam, said he wouldn't deploy unless he knew I could protect myself." Images of those early days flashed through her mind. Frank standing behind her, adjusting her stance, his patient voice guiding her through each step, the pride in his eyes when she'd outshot him for the first time. The trophies they'd won together at the county shooting competitions throughout the E80s. "We used to practice 3 times a week," she continued, "even competed a bit before he retired. Nothing fancy, just local tournaments." The man introduced himself as Jason, a former Army Ranger who now worked as a firearms instructor. His friends, Mark and Devin, were competition shooters. "That's a beautiful 1911, Jason commented, eyeing Frank's pistol with newfound respect. "Not many people can handle that recoil so effectively." Eleanor nodded. Frank maintained it perfectly. "I've tried to do the same since he passed." More people were watching now, several having paused their own shooting to observe. Eleanor felt self-conscious, but also a quiet satisfaction. Frank would have enjoyed this moment. "Would you mind?" if I watched you shoot another round?" Jason asked. "Not at all," Eleanor replied, reloading the magazine. This time, as she took her stance, she was aware of the silence that had fallen over this section of the range. She emptied the magazine again, the shots forming an even tighter grouping. Jason whistled low. "Ma'am, that's better than most of our instructors." A young woman approached, introducing herself as Melissa, an Army veteran. "Did you ever compete professionally? That grouping is match grade?" Eleanor shook her head. "Just local stuff. Frank and I had careers and a son to raise. Shooting was our hobby, not our life." As she packed up her things, Eleanor noticed the changed atmosphere. The smirks and whispers had been replaced by respectful nods and curious glances. Jason approached again, this time with a business card. "We have a veterans shooting group that meets here on Thursday," he said. "Lot of Vietnam-era guys who'd probably enjoy meeting you. Your husband, too, if he's interested." "Frank passed 12 years ago," Eleanor replied softly. "Heart attack." Jason's expression softened. "I'm sorry to hear that. The invitation stands for you, though? No pressure." As Eleanor drove home, the familiar weight of the gun case on the passenger seat, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. A sense of connection to the woman she'd been when Frank was alive. The woman who never backed down from a challenge, who stood confidently beside her husband rather than in his shadow. For the first time in a long while, she was looking forward to next week. Eleanor returned to Blue Ridge the following Thursday, half expecting that the invitation had been mere politeness. Instead, she found Jason waiting in the lobby. "Mrs. Wilson, you made it," he said, extending his hand. "The group's already here. Let me introduce you." He led her to a private range where 8 people were gathered, most of them men in their 60s and 70s. A few younger veterans were there too, including Melissa from the previous week. "Everyone, this is Eleanor Wilson," Jason announced. "She's the one I told you about." The oldest man stepped forward, introducing himself as Richard, a Vietnam veteran like Frank. "Jason says you shoot a 1911, like you were born with it in your hand." Eleanor blushed slightly. "My husband was the real marksman. I just had a good teacher." They welcomed her warmly into their circle, sharing stories of service and civilian life while taking turns at the range. Eleanor learned that many of them had lost spouses or were caring for partners with health issues. They understood the void Frank's absence had left in her life without her having to explain. As they shot, Eleanor noticed Jason observing her technique closely. During a break, he approached. "Mrs. Wilson, Eleanor, please." "Eleanor, I owe you an apology for how we acted last week. It was disrespectful." She waved it off. "You weren't the first to underestimate an old lady, and you won't be the last." "Still," he persisted, "I should have known better. My grandmother was a WAC during Korea. Toughest person I've ever known." Eleanor smiled. "Boo, what did she do in the service?" "Radio operator. Said it taught her patience, which she needed plenty of raising my dad alone after my grandfather died." Their conversation shifted to shooting techniques. Jason was particularly interested in Eleanor's grip, which differed from modern competitive styles but clearly worked for her. "Frank taught me what worked in combat, not what wins trophies," she explained. "It's refreshing," Jason admitted. So many people get caught up in equipment and the latest techniques, they forget the fundamental." By the end of the session, Eleanor had connected with several members of the group who invited her to return. Richard mentioned they sometimes helped train younger veterans who were struggling with the transition to civilian life. "Having someone like you around could make a difference," he suggested. Especially for some of the female vets. The idea of being useful again, of sharing what Frank had taught her, awakened something in Eleanor she'd thought long dormant. As she prepared to leave, Jason approached with an unexpected request. "Some of us are teaching a beginner's safety course this weekend," he said. "Would you consider helping out? Having someone with your experience would be valuable." Eleanor hesitated. "I'm not a certified instructor. You don't need to be for this. It's basic. Safety, stance, grip. The kind of foundational skills that newer shooters often rush through." He paused. The kind of skills you execute perfectly. That Saturday, Eleanor arrived early, nervous but determined. The class consisted of 12 people, mostly women wanting to learn self-defense. When Jason introduced her as a special guest instructor, Eleanor saw the same flash of doubt in their eyes that she'd seen in his the week before. By lunchtime, that doubt had vanished. Eleanor's patient, straightforward guidance resonated with the beginners. Her explanations lacked the technical jargon that often confused newcomers, focusing instead on practical application. "You're a natural teacher," Jason commented as they watched the students practice. "I was a fourth-grade teacher for 30 years, Eleanor replied. "Different subject, same principles." One student, a young woman named Sarah, was particularly struggling with her stance. Eleanor spent extra time with her, making small adjustments. "My husband tried to teach me," Sarah confessed. "We just ended up fighting." Eleanor nodded, understanding. Frank always said, "Teaching someone you love is the hardest job there is." By the end of the day, Sarah was hitting her target consistently. Her confidence visibly improved. As she thanked Eleanor, tears in her eyes, Eleanor felt a sense of fulfillment that had been missing since retirement. Driving home, Eleanor realized she'd gone hours without thinking about the emptiness of her house. For the first time in 12 years, she was looking forward to the future rather than dwelling on the past. Over the next few months, Eleanor became a regular presence at Blue Ridge. The veterans group embraced her as one of their own, and she began assisting with beginner classes every other weekend. Word spread about the elderly woman who could outshoot men half her age, drawing curious observers and respectful students. One Tuesday morning, Eleanor arrived to find an unfamiliar man waiting by her usual lane. He introduced himself as Robert Campbell, the owner of Blue Ridge. "Mrs. Wilson, it's a pleasure to finally meet you. I've heard a lot about you from my staff." Eleanor shook his hand. "All good things, I hope." "Absolutely. In fact, that's why I wanted to speak with you. Your presence here has been noticed. We're seeing more seniors and more women signing up, specifically asking about the classes you help with." He proposed a formal arrangement. Eleanor would become an official instructor for a new program aimed at seniors and women interested in self-defense. "We'd provide certification training, of course," he added. "The pay is competitive." Eleanor was taken aback. At 72, she hadn't expected job offers. "I appreciate the offer, Mr. Campbell, but I'm not looking for employment. I enjoy volunteering," Campbell persisted, explaining the marketing potential. "Your story is compelling. A widow honoring her Marine husband's legacy by teaching others. We could feature you in our advertising." Something about his tone made Eleanor uncomfortable. She sensed that to him, she was a novelty, a marketing gimmick rather than a skilled instructor. "I prefer to keep my personal life private," she said firmly. Campbell looked disappointed, but nodded. "Think about it, at least. The offer stands." That evening, Eleanor mentioned the conversation to Jason during the veterans' session. "Campbell's a businessman first," Jason said cautiously. "He's been pushing for more inspirational stories to feature in promotions." Richard, overhearing, added, "Been trying to get me to do the same. The grizzled Vietnam vet teaching the next generation angle." I told him where he could stick that idea. Eleanor laughed, relieved to know she wasn't being overly sensitive. The following week, she noticed professional photographers at the range during a beginner class she was helping with. One tried to take her picture while she was instructing. When Eleanor objected, the photographer claimed Campbell had authorized it for the website. Jason intervened, sending the photographers away, but the incident left Eleanor unsettled. After class, she sought out Campbell in his office. "Mr. Campbell, I need to make something clear. I'm here to honor my husband's memory and help people, not to be a poster child for your marketing." Campbell's friendly demeanor cooled. "Mrs. Wilson, you're using our facility. What happens here is ultimately my decision. Then perhaps I should find another range," Eleanor responded, her voice steady despite her racing heart. The threat of losing his new draw gave Campbell pause. "Let's not be hasty. What if we compromise? No personal story, No photographs without permission. But you consider the instructor position. Eleanor left without committing, troubled by the exchange. At home, she called her son Michael in California, explaining the situation. "Mom, it sounds like you've found something meaningful," he said. "Don't let this Campbell guy ruin it, but don't let him exploit you either." "Your father would have told him exactly where to go," Eleanor sighed. "Maybe," Michael replied. "Or maybe he'd have found a way to keep doing what he loved without compromising." After hanging up, Eleanor sat on the porch, watching the sunset. The past months had given her purpose again. The thought of giving that up was painful, but so was the idea of being turned into a spectacle. The solution came to her as she cleaned Frank's pistol that evening. The gun had connected them during his deployments, and now it connected her to a community that valued her skills rather than her age. She didn't need Blue Ridge specifically. What she needed was the connection. The next day, Eleanor met with Richard and several other veterans from the group. He explained Campbell's pressure and her reluctance to be featured in marketing. "We don't need him," Richard declared. "Melissa's uncle owns land outside town. He let us set up a private range years ago, before Blue Ridge got so fancy. We still use it sometimes." Melissa nodded. "It's nothing glamorous, but it's private. We could move our veterans' sessions there." "And the beginner classes?" Eleanor asked. Many of the women she'd been teaching had connected with her personally. "We could run those too," Jason suggested. "See, between us, we have all the certifications needed. We've just been using Blue Ridge for convenience." By the end of the meeting, they had the outline of a plan. A community-based teaching program independent of Blue Ridge, using the private range for veterans' session and seeking arrangements with smaller local ranges for public classes. As Eleanor drove home, she felt a blend of anxiety and exhilaration. At 72, she was helping launch what amounted to a new business venture. Frank would have been proud. More importantly, she was proud of herself. The transition wasn't without challenges. Campbell was predictably unhappy when several of his instructors, including Jason, reduced their hours to work with what they now called second shot firearms training. The name had been Eleanor's suggestion, a reference to second chances in life. Their first independent veterans session at Melissa's uncle's property felt like coming home. The simple setup reminded Eleanor of where Frank had first taught her to shoot. Without the overhead of Blue Ridge's expensive facility, they could focus entirely on teaching. Word spread quickly. Several of Eleanor's former students followed her, and new ones came based on recommendation. What had begun as a response to Campbell's marketing pressure evolved into a thriving community service. Eleanor specialized in working with older women, many widowed like herself, who wanted to learn self-defense. Her calm, grandmotherly presence put them at ease, while her skill earned their respect. "You've changed my life," one student told her after mastering basic safety and accuracy. "My children wanted me to move to assisted living after their father died. Now they see I can take care of myself." 6 months after leaving Blue Ridge, Eleanor received an unexpected call from Sarah, the struggling student from her first class. "Mrs. Wilson, I just completed my certification as a range safety officer," she announced proudly. "I'm wondering if Second Shot could use another instructor." Eleanor invited her to the next session, watching with pride as Sarah demonstrated her now confident handling of firearms. Looking around at the diverse group they'd assembled, veterans teaching civilians, seniors teaching youth, women teaching men, Eleanor felt a sense of fulfillment that went beyond anything she'd anticipated when she'd first opened Frank's gun case. On the anniversary of Frank's passing, Eleanor visited his grave with fresh flowers and news to share. "You'd hardly recognize me these days," she told him, settling on the bench near his headstone. Teaching 3 days a week, helping Richard with the books for Second Shot. Even spoke at the county commissioners' meeting about senior safety programs. The wind rustled the leaves of the oak tree overhead, and Eleanor smiled, imagining Frank's gentle laughter. "Remember how you worried about me being alone? Turns out, I'm not alone at all." That evening, the Second Shot team surprised her with a small celebration at Richard's home. They presented her with a plaque commemorating her contribution to the program. To Eleanor Wilson, Jason read, who taught us that expertise has no age limit and that it's never too late for a second shot. As Eleanor looked around at the faces of people who had become her extended family, she thought about the day at Blue Ridge when those young men had smirked at her. Their underestimation had led her here, to this unexpected chapter of her life. Later, as Melissa drove her home, the young veteran asked, "Did you ever imagine things would turn out this way when you first walked into Blue Ridge?" Eleanor gazed out at the Texas hill country rolling past. "No," she admitted. "I was just looking for a way to feel close to Frank again. But I think he would say this is exactly where I'm supposed to be." At home, Eleanor placed the plaque beside the photograph of Frank in his dress blues. In the quiet of their house, she no longer felt the emptiness that had once echoed through the rooms. Instead, she felt purpose, connection, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your worth. The pistol case sat on the table, ready for tomorrow's class. Eleanor ran her fingers over it thoughtfully. What had begun as a link to the past had become her bridge to the future. A future where an elderly woman could still surprise everyone, herself included.